Hello and welcome. You found the Social Work Podcast. My name's Jonathan Singer, and I'll be your host as we explore all things social work. Today's podcast is the second of a three-part series on phone supervision. In today's podcast, I continue my discussion with Simon Feuerman and Melissa Groman about phone supervision. In this episode, we talk about the technical details of setting up and participating in phone supervision. We talk about NASW guidelines for supervision and the benefits of supervision and consultation. And we also talk about the future of phone supervision, including the emergence of webcam technologies. We end with an offline discussion about my experience conducting the interview over the phone. And now on to part 2 of our three-part series on phone supervision with Simon and Melissa. So we've talked about some basic concepts related to phone supervision. I'm wondering if you could talk us through the process of becoming involved with phone supervision. Maybe we could start with the absolute basics. Like, for example, how does somebody find phone supervision to begin with?
There are many ways to find supervision, and obviously with the internet at our fingertips, one can search and one can find any expert that they like and approach them and say, I'm interested in connecting with you, and how would I do this since I live in Alaska and you live in Florida? The other thing that one can do is find out what's already out there that's being provided and make a contact with that person or those people and ask what the procedure is. Generally, it's very simple. You do a discussion over the phone initially to talk about whether this particular person and this particular process is of interest to you and is something worth exploring, and then you try it out. The actual technical procedure is very, very simple. It's only a matter of calling up at the appointed time and calling the telephone number. In most cases with group supervision, there's a PIN code. One dials the phone number, one dials the access number, and voila, you have your community right there. It's very, very easy.
So as supervisors or as the providers of phone supervision, how did you set up the phone number, the PIN number, all those sorts of things?
I wish I could tell you that it was a very arduous and complicated procedure. But in fact, I went onto Google and we together looked at a number of companies that provide conference lines and phone conferencing, and a number of them do it for free. I don't exactly know the model in which they use, which enables them to provide the service free, but they do it free, and it's every bit as good as the services that charge money for it. It couldn't be easier. You type in your phone number on the web, and then in many cases, you can pick your own access code. And then to those people who are invited onto the group supervision, you give them the access code. And if the group meets at 9 o'clock on a Wednesday night, and you just tell everyone to show up and to get on the phone and Wednesday night at 9 o'clock. And when they get on the phone, there's a little ding, and it says, oh, who's come on? And somebody says, oh, it's Jack, and this is Melissa, and this is Simon, and people talk just as they would if they had assembled in a room somewhere.
Do you notice any difference in quality of connection for people using landlines versus cell phones? And if so, do you make any requirements about the quality of connection that people need to have in order to participate in phone supervision?
Well, there are differences in different companies that provide phone conferencing. So we try and use a very high-quality company. And absolutely, cell phones are not the greatest in terms of connections fading in and out. So if possible, one should use a landline if they can. The other problem with cell phones is that a lot of times people do use cell phones when they're doing other things. And we do suggest that people be present and not be driving or cooking or doing anything else, that when they're with us, they're with us.
That's correct. We actually tell people one pleasure at a time.
Are there environments that your supervisees have let you know are more conducive to actually benefiting from supervision than others?
I think that as long as the supervisee or the participant on the call is comfortable where they're sitting and is able to be present, then it doesn't really matter where they are. We would suggest, usually, as Simon was talking about earlier, that a lot of folks call in actually from the office. So they're comfortable in their chair. Their mindset is in the work, is in the process, is in the connection. It's a break from having to be on with a client, and they can be present with themselves, with colleagues, and as long as they're comfortable. We don't recommend anything unusual. We certainly don't recommend driving.
Have you had any feedback or input from your supervisees that there's actually something beneficial about being in their office?
Absolutely. The contiguousness of the work experience as it pertains to supervision seems to be paramount. We were just talking the other day. One of the ideas in treatment is to get a person out of the environment that they're in and to connect with another environment. That would be different in supervision. In supervision, we really want them to continue working and to continue to focus on the work. It's true that as part of the work, sometimes we need to leave ourselves and be exposed to another point of view.
The NASW standards for clinical social work state that social workers should receive supervision for 5 years after they get their license. Even though it's not legally binding, it is the standards of our profession. What's true is that most people who are in private practice have been practicing for longer than 5 years, and there can be a certain level of comfort that people settle into, and they think, well, I don't need supervision. And there's nothing that says you must get supervision.
We've found that there's two maybe core issues that come up for higher level clinicians and even experienced and seasoned clinicians, is that there's always a discussion about effectiveness and doing good work and autonomy. And there's a lot of fear about being able to recreate the feeling and the ideas that go on between client and therapist in the room, and being able to convey that in a way that the clinician will get understood and be able to do better work, and to be able to kind of pull out what's an induced feeling, what's a transference, what's a countertransference, what's the clinician's own dependency needs, own abandonment fears. There's so many facets to it. And some clinicians are so frightened of A, not being understood, and very seasoned clinicians, and B, not doing good work, and C, which goes hand in hand with not feeling effective. And it's just fascinating to me that even as you're saying that there's a 5-year post-license suggestion, there's no external mandate. And clinicians are frightened, or they want to behave autonomously, and it's sort of it's just interesting. And I'll beat the horse to say that I really feel very passionate that people really do feel better about themselves and they do better work when they're willing to talk.
Yeah, I would add to that the pleasure component of the experience, which is that we really do find, I mean, maybe, we've not emphasized it enough, is that people who are motivated to do it, they do it really because they want to. They want to have that connection. And there's really no reason you shouldn't have that pleasure of the supervision. It really does deepen the work. The cost is very minimal when you compare it to other things. Cost does not seem to be the issue for people in not doing it. There seems to be an internal issue about it. Anyway, but it's just a lot of fun. It's a very, very, I mean, we now actually run a number of groups. They're very attractive groups, very, very bright people. And one thing that we do want to add, which has again been a series of surprises for us, is that the people who are the most well-trained, who have the PhDs, who have the many years of psychoanalytic training, or in other cases CBT training, they are the ones who opt for the groups. The ones who are the least trained don't want that. But the ones who are the most trained seem to gravitate towards more and more training.
It's a fascinating thing because people do have an ego issue, whereas I'm a good clinician, I could be doing the supervision, I don't need to have somebody supervise me. And we do bump into that, and that's why we want to really shape the idea that it's not about, it is about accessing experts, but it is not a corporate model at all where somebody knows how to run the department and you have to do what they say. It's a completely different model where there's always a need when you're working to be talking about yourself, about the work, and it's not, yes, new ideas are generated, but it's the process that is really, that fulfills the ethical and the personal satisfaction of saying, I'm really talking about myself, my work, it's good, it's the right thing to be doing. And that it's not necessarily, even though there is respect for people that have a higher level of training, that it really isn't necessarily about going to somebody who knows more and them telling you what to do. It's really about being willing to be together and to be involved. You mentioned the word community, and that's what it is, to be involved in a community of your colleagues.
When the people have the idea, maybe initially, that the supervisor knows more than them, and they have a negative reaction to that. I could be teaching it, I'm older than you, I'm more experienced. That's not really that's a classic model of supervisor. That connotes somebody who is over you. But what we really do find is that the supervisor is a facilitator who is monitoring the group to make sure that each person's needs get met, as opposed to knowing more. There are people in every group that know a great deal more than we do, but that is irrelevant. What's relevant seems to be to have communication move progressively so that people can get what they need and what they want from the group.
And that, like in any group or in any therapy, it's very important to have someone whose interest is in protecting the group members and in watching the process and working with the group as a whole, so that it's a safe environment and it's a good environment. And there are a lot of peer supervision groups that work in some way, and they're wonderful. I do have a particular bias in supervised peer supervision groups, only because it's good, like Simon said, to have someone facilitating that everyone's needs are getting met and that people are protected, because as we know in this work, so many feelings come up, and it's good to have someone whose job it is to be tending to all of the different dynamics that sprout up.
So you're really saying that there's so much that goes on for clinicians, regardless of the modality, that it's important to have a venue to express these things and to process these things. And furthermore, that if you're using group supervision, then regardless of whether it's on the phone or whether it's face-to-face, that using some of these tried and true techniques and methods and concepts of group process apply.
We couldn't agree more. Absolutely. You said it very well.
So the last question. With the advent of sites like YouTube and Google Videos, it seems like people are rapidly becoming comfortable in front of the camera, at times embarrassingly so. As a result, people are using webcams like never before. How do you think that this increase with comfort with video technology will change the way that distance supervision is conducted in the future? So, in other words, do you think that in 10 years we'll be doing a podcast on the use of video supervision?
In medical, video imaging has been going on for the last 20 years by phone, and it seems to be restricted on that end. On the other end, webcams have a kind of a cheesy, almost sinister patina to them. And so what we're looking at, what's really required in the next 10 years is not necessarily the technology, but the normalization for everyday experiences. And yes, we definitely do anticipate that's going to happen.
Like Simon said, I think that it has a little bit of a cheesy connotation in certain areas, and once it gets normalized and people are using it much more professionally, which we see is happening with the phone. For a long time, I think that phone conferencing, I remember back when I was in junior high school, and there was these numbers that all the kids could call, and you could talk on the phone. It was a group number, and it was always very exciting to see who could call this number, and it progressed, and now phone conferencing is one of the most legitimate forms of communication in corporate America uses it, certainly. And I know that there's been an absolute explosion in 12-step programs that use phone conferencing to have meetings. There are many, many tens of meetings every day for different 12-step programs over the telephone. So we see the progression in phone work to being something that's wonderful and accessible and completely useful to folks. Certainly I think it's going to happen with video conferencing too.
Thank you guys for taking the time and sharing your expertise with us today on this podcast on phone supervision.
Okay, our pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
After the interview, Simon, Melissa, and I continued to talk about the process of taking the interview we just did over the phone and turning it into a podcast. And then something interesting happened. Simon asked me what it was like doing an interview over the phone. And just like that, our roles switched, and Simon became the interviewer, and I became the interviewee. Now, in retrospect, this makes sense. Simon was doing what he does, which is help people process their experience over the phone. Now, I've included a few minutes of our off-camera discussion because I think it hints at the experience of phone supervision. What you're about to hear is my response to Simon's question about doing an interview over the phone, and then some additional comments by Simon and Melissa about my experience. Since this is the very first remote interview that I've done, to provide meta commentary here, the experience of not having you guys face to face has been a bit disorienting for me, and I think it's something that I'm going to need to get used to, because I do hope to do more remote interviews because I think it's an excellent way of accessing experts that are not available in the Pittsburgh area, or at least that I'm not aware of. So,
what do you think that you felt deprived of most here in terms of the face-to-face experience?
One of the things that was challenging was that in the face-to-face interviews, I find myself providing my interviewees with a lot of visual but non-verbal encouragement with regards to their answers that I was unable to provide over the phone. So, for example, most of the people that I talk to are not used to being interviewed. And so they'll start in on an answer, and I can tell in their mind, they're like, is this really what I want to be saying? And so then I can nod my head, I can sort of be like, oh, that's interesting, furrow my brow or smile or those sorts of things. I do it all silently so it doesn't get picked up by the microphone. But I have found that to be challenging in this interview. There were times where I wondered how you felt about your responses and how to manage the flow of the discussion.
That's very much speaks to the issue, and your words had an influence on me. I felt you were very present. I mean, I had a number of other phone conversations with you, and I do understand how the verbal cues really can be very beneficial when you're interviewing someone. I'm thinking of the classic interviews of Frost Nixon and things like that.
Having the visual cues of me in the room nodding, just like you might with your client as they're going through their work, just to be able to just silently do that. I think those were missing.
Right. So, and we couldn't cue you in either, from our side, but we were very comfortable.
Right. But I did understand that your pauses and your silences, Jonathan, were an opportunity for me to jump in if I wanted to. And I'm very comfortable jumping in and even interrupting politely. So I appreciated those silences, and I understood them as a communication to me. There were a few times where I didn't have anything to add. When you offered me the opportunity by name, I did in fact want to chime in.
And this concludes the first two parts of our three-part series on phone supervision. Please join us for part 3, in which I talk with Jody Bechtold about her experience as the recipient of phone supervision. I'm Jonathan Singer, and thanks for being with me today for another episode of the Social Work Podcast. If you missed an episode or have suggestions for future episodes, please visit socialworkpodcast.com. If you'd like to support the podcast, please visit our online store at cafepress.com/swpodcast. To all the social workers out there, keep up the good work. We'll see you next time at the Social Work Podcast.